Before we start, let's go over what I'm gonna be using for today's sew along. So first, I'm using this very beautiful herringbone linen heavy suiting that was gifted to me by Core Fabrics. It's really beautiful. It presses really well, which is interesting for a linen and a tailored piece. So it has basically the appearance and the behavior of wool, but it is linen. So that's what I'm going to be using today. And with that, I have some simple acetate lining from my local store. What is particular about Freja Vest pattern is that all the pattern pieces are interfaced. All the main front and back pieces are interfaced, front, back, side, back. And what I like to use for tailored projects is this weft interfacing. This is a fusible interfacing that is a bit particular in texture. And what it does is that it basically adds structures without making the fabric too stiff and without giving any cardboard effect. So that works really well on the fabric we're using today. It works really well on any kind of wool suiting, coat project that you might be working on. And for extra structure, all the edges, also the armhole edges, the front edge, the neckline, but we'll talk about that more in a minute, is also interfaced again with fusible tape. Sometimes you can find more or less stable fusible tape. Sometimes it has a line of stitching through it, which makes it more stable. For this project, you can basically use any kind you find. And in case you cannot find fusible tape, my suggestion to you is to cut like 1 centimeter wide, regular fusible, thin fusible interfacing in order to achieve the same effect. Here it comes as tape, but it's just basically a bit more practical. Here you can see a piece of our main fabric that has been already interfaced for a test. And as I said, you can see that it really retains its drape and its movement, but also that it has more structure than our uninterfaced fabric. So if I pull it out to show you, here we have something a little bit lighter. And here we have basically the same movement, but with a bit more structure. So to cut and fuse the main fabric, you have 2 options. The first one is to follow the more traditional home sewing way of first cutting the fabric, then cutting the interfacing, and then fusing it. And the second one is to use the method called block fusing, which is a bit more of an industry technique, and that is very relevant when you need a large number of your pieces to be interfaced. So here, basically, we interface almost all of our fabric, and then we lay the pattern pieces according to the cutter's must and cut out once the fabric already interfaced. So on the back pieces, this is the side, the 2 side backs, we also apply an additional layer of the fusible tape that I showed you earlier around everything that will become the armhole. Here we have the armhole and our neckline. And this is a very important step to prevent anything from being distorted and also showing crisp, nice edges. Another thing that I like to do at this stage is also to pre-press the hem up. So using the notches that you should have transferred here, just pre-press the hem in position, and it will really help make your life a bit easier in the later stages of construction. So this is for the back, and we have basically our pieces that are ready. And for the front, this is our front piece, main front piece. As you can see, the markings have been transferred with thread tracing. You can do chalk, you can do thread. The already interfaced piece has been reinforced again against the armhole. Here we also did the shoulder seam just for a little extra stability. We have the neckline and the front edge. On the side, front, it's the same. We have already, here we're going to do the welt pocket. So we have already our welt pocket mark that is in position with thread tracing, and we have the rest of the armhole already being reinforced with the fusible tape. On the front and the back facing, we do not add fusible tape because we will use our main layer as the guide, and we don't want to create edges that become too bulky or too stiff. So once you've cut all your main pattern pieces and your lining pieces, we are ready to start with the first step of construction, which is the back belt. So the back belt piece is actually one piece that will become 2. and it's one of the very few pattern pieces that does not require to be interfaced in this project. And as you can see, on the pattern piece, there is a cut line that we're going to be using in a minute. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to fold this belt lengthwise, wrong sides together, and I'm going to press that edge. So now that I've pressed it, I'm going to be cutting it along the cut line so that I have two belt pieces. So this is not where we cut it. And now we have our two ties, which we're going to be pinning onto our main back piece. And we're going to be using the notches to help us with the alignment here. So we locate our back notches. And we're going to be putting the shorter tie on the left side when it's worn, and the longer tie on the right side of the back. Here we go. So now basically our back is ready for the next step, and that's the princess seams. So for the princess seams, the most important part is to make sure that you had transfer your notches correctly, so that you can pin and just align mostly the notches, and then you might have to ease a little bit the fabric into the curves. So mostly what will happen is that on the most curved edge, so on the side front or on the side back, this section between the notches is likely to require a little bit of ease, and that you can adjust at the machine, or you can kind of absorb the ease with some steam with your iron. So don't forget these notches. They are very important for the next step. Based on that, you can proceed with pinning the different princess seams to prepare your work. So here I'm pinning the front to the side front. I would align mostly the notches. On this fabric it's not necessarily very easy to see, so you need to just pull a tiny bit to see where the exact notches are. They are here. This is one of these occasions where maybe I will use a little bit more pins than I would in other places, but I also would not necessarily pin all along the way, because I really want to keep that flexibility of easing things in the machine. And you can kind of see that it's not difficult, like the curves are matching, so it's actually not difficult to find the way you're going to be making things work. You see, when you're easing, you don't want to like put the fabric super flat. You really want to think of the only place where they need to match is where actually the seam line is going to be. So there is no need to over manipulate and to distort the fabric unnecessarily. You just need to make sure that your main marks are in position and that things will align at the seam line. Anywhere else is actually not necessary. So that's for the front, the pinning of one of the fronts. And we do the same thing for the back, pinning the back, with the little difference that we have actually cut our belt into the side seam. Let's go to the machine and stitch those with the 1 centimeter seam allowance, and that's 3/8 of an inch in the imperial system. So after I was done stitching, I pressed my princess seams open, and here I want to show you a couple of things. The first thing is that I repressed my hem always back in position. My seams are pressed open. I actually press the belt towards the side seam. So we press the belt seam allowance towards the side panel so that they lay flat, and it helps them lay towards the center. What you will maybe notice that I did not do is clip into my princess seams. Personally, if I can avoid it, I don't like to weaken my seams. So here I did not add weakness to my seams because everything presses nice and flat. I don't have excess that would need to be removed. So there's really no need for this clipping. So on the front, same thing. The hem is pressed back in place. Our seam is pressed open. No clipping. just absorbing with steam the excess a little bit here. Of course, in this seam, whether you would need to clip a little bit or not also depends on the fabric that you are using. So if they take steam really well and can be shaped and kind of absorb the extra volume, it's easier not to clip. If you have something bulkier or stiffer, you might need some minimal clipping or just reducing the seam allowance. The last thing I wanted to point out is that when pressing the front, it's really important not to create a very flat front like you did in the back, but to maintain the bust shaping. So especially for this kind of fabric, it would be fairly easy to accidentally almost flatten everything out, and you would lose basically the drafting that kind of creates the shape for the bust here. So from now on, it's also a good idea to keep this area kind of raised or, you know, not completely flat on the table, but also not bunched up in a messy way. Now that we've done this, we can move on to our front pocket. So the front pocket that we're going to be using here, the option is going to be the welt pocket. And for that, we're going to be using our welt pieces. So the one that's going to be the welt, and this one is going to be the shield, so that when you open the pocket, you don't see lining, but you see a piece of the main fabric. And the way you can differentiate those is that this one is fused for the welt, and this one is not fused. Except that in my case, I forgot and I fused it, but let's pretend it's not fused. And then we have our upper and lower pocket bags, and I'll come back to these two pattern pieces cut in lining when we get to the back piece. So first, we're now gonna be marking a little bit more on our front and on our welt pieces. So first, I'm gonna be making sure that my rectangle for the welt is still the right dimension. So I'm gonna be joining basically the marks with the upper. I'm gonna be using the upper edge of the welt pocket as my reference. And I know that my welt pocket is 1 centimeter tall. That's 3/8 of an inch. I'm gonna also be marking the middle. We want it to be 13 centimeters. We're gonna use the marking of the front to be the reference, and I'm gonna mark 13 centimeters so that we end up with the right dimension of welt pocket here. You can check on your pattern pieces what's the intended size also, and check that you have everything in place. So now basically this is where we're gonna be stitching. So what you can do for your welt is transfer everything from the pattern piece, all the markings, to make sure that you have them all. And I'm basically gonna be drawing them straight onto my fabric on the right side, so I have everything in place when I sew. So first I start by indicating the center of my rectangle, and I'm gonna start by the first lines which correspond to the finished height of the welt, which is a total of 3/8 of an inch. That's 1 centimeter. And then I'm gonna be adding the fold line and the stitch line. And that's a little bit of an unusual construction for a one-piece double welt pocket. I find it quite quick and accurate. So that's why that's the one I included in this pattern for you to try. This welt piece also works for more traditional construction methods. So you can also do that in case this does not work for you. And then I'm gonna be adding the end of the welt on each side. So here we are. So now I'm gonna go and press along the fold line like so on one side, and then the same thing on the other side before we pin it to the front and we go to the machine. Okay, so now I pressed it and I overlapped my rectangle from the welt to the front, right sides together. And what we're gonna do is that we're gonna go at the machine and we're gonna stitch exactly in between these lines here. And we're gonna stop exactly at the beginning and exactly at the end. Then we're gonna lift slightly this part of the welt, remove the pins of course, and then we're gonna do the same thing for this stitching line here. So let's go to the machine. So now that we are at our machine, we're gonna be stitching, starting exactly from our starting point. And I'm gonna decrease a little bit the stitch length compared to what I would normally do. And I stay 3/16 away from my folded edge, 5 millimeters. And we stop when we reach the perpendicular line, back stitches. Now for the second one. So I push the first welt a little bit out of the way to make sure we don't stitch on top of it accidentally. And I prepare the location for the second one. And let's go. Just and we stop precisely. That's it. Now that we're gonna go back to our main working area and we're gonna open the welt in between, both the welt and the front, in between our 2 lines of stitching. So now I'm just gonna control that the welts start at the right level, both of them, and I'm gonna open in between my stitch lines. I keep it separate with my fingers. Let's open. And we finish with a little V shape when we get to the beginning on each side. Don't overdo it, but also don't be scared of going to the edge when you cut your V, because that's also what's gonna help us give it a nice shape at the corner and avoid puckers. You have to go all the way. And already you see that you can turn your welt around and it's already getting in position. So now with a lot of pressing, we can help it lay better before we go to the next stages. After pressing my welt and before I do anything else, I'm going to baste them together closed to avoid any change in the shape during the rest of the construction. And I'm only going to remove this basting thread when the vest is completely finished. This is very quick and it really helps with the overall appearance at the end and the neatness of the work. We just close them and keep the 2 welts flush with each other. And we're just going to do a quick knot at the end so that we can just cut the basting thread. That's it. Now we're going to go back to the machine and I'm going to stitch. So I'm going to push aside first the front of the vest and I'm going to stitch without catching the front just across the welt and the little triangle that we cut earlier. And then I'm going to do the same thing for this side. Just one little line of stitching to make sure that these corners are neat. Okay, so I sewed my corners here and there and I pressed one more time. So now that we have stitched our corners, we can start working on the pocket bag. And for the pocket bag, we have basically our shield that will go straight behind the welt. So I'm gonna start by attaching at the machine the upper pocket bag, the bigger one, to the bottom of the welt. And then also the lower pocket bag to the shield. So now we have our upper pocket bag that is stitched to the welt. We have our shield with lower pocket bag. And basically what we're going to do now is first stitch these 2 together here with the welt. And then we're going to go all around and close the bottom of the pocket bag. So now that it's all stitched, if you have pinking scissors and like mine, your lining tends to fray a lot, now is a good time to use them on the edges of the pockets so you don't add the bulk of serging or overlocking or zigzag inside your structure, which matters. And there we have it. We have our double welt pocket on our front, and we're now ready to move on to the next step. So for the next step, we're going to be assembling our front and backs at the shoulder seams, and you will notice that the back shoulder are a little bit longer than the front shoulder because they are meant to be eased in. So to do that easing, just put a pin in the beginning, pin in the end, and then you can go at iron, and with steam, you can steam the excess into the front. You can also, like we did here, you can also put in a little bit of a tight easing stitch into the shoulder. That's another alternative way of doing it. Personally, when I do it quickly, I just do it with a bit of steam. On most fabrics like this one that will react well to the steam, it will do a good job. I will go at the machine and I will stitch this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now that the shoulders of the vest are sewn and the seams are pressed open, we can basically put the vest aside for now, but it's starting to take shape, and we can start working on our lining. For the back lining, once you assemble it to the side back lining, what you need to do is to create an ease pleat. So the way to do that is to keep your center back folded in two, the same way that you've cut it, and to stitch for about 4 centimeters from the bottom of the back lining and at the top of the back lining, just a bit here, so that you create this ease pleat before you assemble to the back facing. And so this is what it looks like when it's done. You have here your back lining that was cut on the fold, a side back lining, back facing. And if I turn it around, you can see that here I have my ease pleat. So I've stitched the bottom of the lining here for about, as I said, 4 centimeters, 1 5/8. And the same thing here before I assemble that seam that is then pressed towards the lining. So here we have our back lining and facing all ready to go. So now we're going to assemble the front lining and the front facing. And the most important element of that step is that we're going to leave this portion of the seam not done, unsewn. So we're going to start a few centimeters, a few inches even away. I say 10 centimeters, maybe about 4 inches away from the bottom edge. And that's where we're going to start pinning, because this section will be sewn later on as we're finishing the hem of the vest. So let's put in some pins so that we can stitch it together with here a 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And let's see where that takes us. So we have our back lining and facing. We have our front lining and facing, on which I've left the bottom open, and I've pressed our lining to facing seam towards the lining so that it limits the bulk. We have the two fronts, and I've already pinned the shoulder seams. So I'm gonna sew those with the 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and press them open. Our lining is ready, with the facing and the front lining still being free. The shoulder seams are pressed open, and now we can start assembling the main vest with the lining. To do that, I'm going to start by putting the vest face up on my table, and I'm gonna start by pinning the armholes together. And before pinning, I will match some key reference points. So for me, that will be the shoulder seams, the front princess seam, the beginning and the end of the armholes. So we are putting these pins in these strategic points, and what you will maybe already notice is that it looks like our facing lining elements have grown a little bit. So if you remember, we have interfaced the armhole edges only on the main, the outer layer of the vest, and it actually did a really good job at preventing any disturbance, because even though I did not manipulate these pieces too much, you can already see that I'm gonna have to do some easing here so that everything continues to match. But this is not something too dramatic, so it's really a process of just manipulating the fabric so that the facing matches the main layer. And if in case you have a little bit too much excess, you can always use steam of your iron to just reduce a little bit this excess. So I'm just adding these pins for the armhole just to get things started. And we're gonna go to the machine. So you can see that after it's understitched and it's not pressed yet, if I was putting it in the right position, it immediately holds the fabric much better and the edge is gonna be very sharp and neat. Also, the drafting of the lining and the facings ensure that they are slightly smaller and allow for the turn of cloth of the main layer. So they will actually, this will help also keeping everything in place when you are wearing your vest and it's finished. Now the next step is to of course do the other armhole and its understitching, and then we can move on to the neckline. I have finished my armhole, my second armhole, and I have pinned my neckline with maybe a little bit more pins than you've seen me use before, partly because I wanted to resorb some of the excess that had been created, maybe with some light stretching on the facing side. So I also matched my shoulder seams, my center back, and the front and back. And now we're gonna sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around 0.6 centimeter all around the neckline. And cut the thread. Now that I'm done sewing my neckline, I'm just going to again trim the corners of the seam allowances on the shoulder seams around the neckline just to decrease the bulk overall, especially in this fabric that's a bit heavier. And then I'm just going to understitch the front of the neckline as far as I can, just to further stabilize it and avoid it peeking out. Although now it's a little bit difficult to go into and understitch the entire neckline. So I'm just going to understitch here, laying the seam allowance towards the facing lining side and understitch this section of the front as far as I can before I work on the front edges of the vest. So now that I've understitched the beginning of my front neckline, I'm gonna be sewing the front edges together. So this is the front of the vest and this is the front of the facing, and I'm gonna be putting them right sides together and just stitch with a 1/4 inch 0.6 centimeter seam allowance. And the one trick that I want to show you here is how to lay the corner so that you have a really neat little corner here at the center front. And instead of keeping the seam allowance kind of straight and stitching across, you're gonna use the fact that it's already been understitched also, and you're gonna lay it over the facing or the lining side. And this will really help with the turn of cloth. And when you're gonna turn the angle around, you will see that we have actually formed a very neat corner in that area. So I just press with my fingers, I press it in position toward the seam allowance towards the lining and facing side. I'm gonna put a pin. I'm gonna pin the rest of my seam, of my front edge seam, to make sure that it matches and that the front facing has not stretched too much compared to the main front. And I'm gonna stitch it again with a 1/4 seam allowance. After sewing that front edge seam together, I will again understitch it. I've managed to sew almost until 3 centimeters away from the top of the vest, so that's 1 inch and a quarter. And I will now trim this corner seam allowance. The next step is to sew the other front edge and to turn the vest around on the right side. Now it's time to turn our vest around onto the right side, and I cannot stress this enough. You absolutely need to turn the vest around before you complete the side seams. Otherwise, you will not be able to turn it around after you're bagged your lining, and it will be a very frustrating experience. Turn it around. I go into the back, put my hand into the armhole, the shoulder seam, and I pull the front through the back. So I do it first on one side, pull it gently, but firmly, and now it's coming through. And it's a little bit of an exciting step, right? Things are starting to look like a vest. So we have our first front, and we'll go all the way and pull my corner temporarily for now, but you can see that everything is in position. And now I will do the same thing for the other side. I put my hand into the back shoulder seam and I press the front into my hand and I just pull through the shoulders. There you go. Okay. Now we can help the front neckline corners to come out a little bit. Use your preferred tool for that. Be mindful of the kind of fabric that you are working with, how fragile it is, and of course be gentle in these kind of operations. You can help it form a little bit with your fingers as well to make sure that things are flat and square. And now I'm going to go at my ironing station and iron all these edges nice and flat so that we can proceed with the side seam. All my edges are now neatly pressed and you can see that the inner layer basically stays nicely inside. So it's time to pin together our side seams. So we will again pin them right sides together, putting some pins in the key spots, and we're gonna sew them in one go between the lining and the main vest. So we start by opening the back where we have the lining of the back, the facing, and the back, the side back piece. And I'm gonna put on top, right sides together, the front. So I start by putting a pin into the side seam, the underarm seam, where I want it to match. And then just pin from one side to the other, aligning the waist notches. Here you see that my pocket extra, the extension of the pocket bag and my welt is almost going into the side seam. So when you sew the seam, you want to be particularly careful about not catching the pocket. And then we'll go all the way down, matching the notches at the hem. Okay, there we go. So now we stitch the seam in one go with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. That's 1 centimeter. And we're gonna press it open and then repeat for the other side seam. Side seams are done and pressed, and I left an opening in one of the lining side seams, which I always forget to do. So I feel very grateful that today for this video I did. So one is completely closed and the other one has an opening to be able to turn everything back to the right side. So now that we are here, we are ready to start the last part that is a bit more technical about this pattern before the finishing touches, and that's our hem lining section all by machine. So our starting point is a hem that is not attached to the lining, and when it will be in its final position, it will be pressed up and the lining will be attached to it and we'll have an ease pleat. So it will have this little excess here that you see, because the lining is shorter, but not so short that it would have to be sewn straight onto the hem. So it will be folded, seamed, and with a little overhang here to make sure that it does not pull the vest up when it's being worn. So we have to form that pleat, in particular when we assemble that section here, and everything here would be done by machine. So we will have this section that will come in folded here, the hem that goes up, the lining that goes in with its fold. So it's a little bit of a magic trick and I'm going to be showing you how to do this in a minute. But first, what we need to do is to pin the lining to the hem without catching anything else. And to do that, we're going to again turn things around, but this time we're going to form what we call more or less a bag. So that's why this is called bagging the lining. So we create a bag between the lining and the vest, the hem of both sections, and everything else is inside that bag. So we can put some pins to keep the hem together. And I'm just gonna pin as usual in the beginning and in the end, and also where all the princess seams, side seam, center back meet. It's important to be precise in aligning these spots because you don't want the lining to twist around. Otherwise, it will really start distorting the appearance of the vest even on the right side, and it will just be unpleasant to wear. So if you're sewing your lining by hand, it's easier to make sure as you are lining it to make sure that it's in the right position. But if you're doing it by machine, just spend a little extra time to align these strategic spots so you don't end up with a wonky lining at the end. And now I'm gonna sew this hem, so just the section starting from the front, not the facing, just this section with a 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all across, front and back. So let's sew our hem and lining together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance without catching anything else but the bottom. Now our hem is done and we want to now finish the section between the hem, the facing, and the lining. So what we're going to start by doing is pinning right sides together, our front with our front facing at the bottom, and we're going to use the same trick of laying the seam allowance of the front edge towards the facing, using also the understitching as our guide. So we make it sure it lays very flat, but instead of keeping it straight and stitching across, we fold it towards the facing. And I'm gonna place one first pin here. Then we keep the edges of the facing and the front together, and we're gonna keep stitching straight with a 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance up to 1 centimeter before the end of the front facing. So we're gonna stop exactly in that point. That is 1 centimeter, 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch from both edges. And you can measure that and place a pin. And we're not gonna catch anything else in that first seam. So be mindful to keep your lining out of the way. And let's stitch. When we reach the point that I've indicated earlier, 1 centimeter away from both edges, we're gonna leave the needle down. Okay, let's start. I keep the lining away from my work area and I go exactly and keep my needle down. I'm gonna remove my needles, my pins, sorry. And now I'm gonna pivot my work with the needle down just a little bit so I can go and clip up to my needle in the layer that is below, in the front of the vest. So now, and that allows me to pivot. So now what I will do is that I will bring towards me, I have now the hem because I can move it around now that I've clipped this area, and I have the lining, and I bring the top layer to the around so that I can align it, and I can align the edges without puckers around the needle. And I am repositioned to continue stitching now with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, but now we are from the edge, and now we are finishing the seam between the front facing and the lining. And what you will notice is that the lining is a little bit longer, like there is an excess of fabric here. So what we want to do is to fold it neatly inside so that it forms a pleat here between the two layers. So we're gonna stitch. Under we have the hem allowance, on top we have the front facing, and inside as a sandwich with a pleat we'll have our lining. And we're gonna keep everybody flat with a 1 centimeter seam allowance until we reach the seam of the front lining and the front facing that we had left unfinished, and that we are here. Then we can cut, and we just need to clip and trim a little bit our angles. So this is the angle of the front edge. So I'm going to be reducing that angle to remove some of the bulk. And I'm also going to be trimming that angle here at that section where I pivoted to help it. You can also grade your seams. So half the seam allowance of one of the two layers that are together, just to have a little bit less bulk, which is important in a fabric with a bit more volume like this one. Okay, I'm going to repeat this for the second corner, for the corner on the other side of the front. And then we're going to be ready to turn our work around to do the final catch stitch of the hem when it's in position. Let's do that second corner together so that you can see it from the other angle. When it's the first time that you're doing this, it looks a little bit confusing, so it can be helpful to see exactly how it looks like under my machine and under yours. So now we're working on the other side, meaning that I have my front here, my front facing on this side, front lining, hem allowance. So I put the seam allowance of the front edge towards the front facing. Keep everything flat, and I keep it in with one pin. I align the front facing with the bottom edge of the front, and I place a pin exactly 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch from both sides, so that I know exactly from both edges, here and there. So here 1 centimeter, so I know exactly where I'm going to stop on this side. So we go under the machine, 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We stitch up to our pin mark. Okay, I leave the needle down, I pivot. I'm going to remove my needles, which is a bit more difficult when you're working under. I clip the top layer, which is the front, up to the needle. Okay, so I pivot everything around to bring back towards me the seam of the front facing and the front lining. And here it's even easier to see that excess that we were talking about in the lining, because it kind of folds back on its own, right? So now you can see very easily this excess of lining that we were talking about, and I push it to create the pleat here up to where it wants to go, and I place the piece of the facing on top so I can sew one smooth straight seam with still my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And we are here. We have a bit of a mess of thread by now, but this is almost time to turn everything on the right side, so it's unsurprising. That's it. We have our second corner. We trim it. So I remove the other side of where I already clipped. That's an area to be careful with when you trim. I trim my corner here, and I will grade some of my seams just to remove a bit of the bulk. That's it. Our corners are going to be nice and smooth when you turn everything around. Okay, let's finish this up. We have done our two corners, so they present like this on each side. And now what we want to do to make sure that things don't move while wearing is that we're going to catch stitch our hem in its final position. So to do that, I'm going to basically use the pressing marks that I've kept. You may have noticed that I always kept my hem in place. So I'm going to fold the hem allowance in its final position, but bringing up the lining as well. And I'm going to put some pins to keep it in that position. As always, you see that I'm matching in priority the princess seams, the side seams. They're a bit my landmark and my anchors to keep everything where they should be. When I reach to the front, you can see that we were basically working with things kind of pressed up on this side. So it's useful to kind of push the corner in the way that it will be when worn. And we're just gonna catch stitch the hem up to the front princess seam. There is really no need to go in there. It's catch stitching, so it's really just something to make sure that the hem doesn't drop over time. It's just an anchor. I'm gonna go up to here. Now the side seam. Pushing the little corner in to allow for the turning. Hem in its position. Seams matching. And here we go. Okay. So now we're ready to catch stitch. If you need a couple of extra pins, you can sometimes just make your catch stitching a little bit faster. So I've already prepared my needle with my matching thread. I've knotted it, and I'm just gonna go through a little exercise of mindful sewing with a simple catch stitching of the hem. Normally, this is exactly the time to take your sewing to your preferred form of entertainment, whether that's a good podcast, audiobook, or show. This is, I think, one of the things that many sewists enjoy when doing these finishing touches. Of course, while you're doing this, you don't want this to show on the right side of your fabric. So you can take a fairly large portion of fabric into the hem allowance on the side of the lining, because you have very little risk there and it's not going to show. But when you are attaching to the front of the vest, you really want to be careful with the amount of fabric that you're taking into your stitch so that you don't go all the way through and it doesn't show. After I finished catch stitching my hem, I turned the garment to the right side through the opening in the side seam lining, and then I pressed everything in position, maintaining, of course, a little ease pleat of the lining at the bottom. For the back belt, I wanted to use something that I had in my stash. So in my case, this was these two simple D-rings. And I attached them with my sewing machines with just 2 lines of stitching. In case your machine struggles to get too close to the D-rings, you can use a zipper foot when you're stitching belts. Now I can just thread the other side into first the 2 D-rings and then into only one of them. And we have our back belt that you can use to adjust how fitted you want and how defined you want the waist of the vest to be. Before marking and sewing my buttonholes, I controlled the spacing and the placement using my front pattern piece. And now I'm gonna be putting the 2 fronts together, so wrong sides together, to control where my buttons should be attached. So for that, I just align the edges precisely and I pin them together in between the buttonholes. And I go directly inside the buttonhole and I pin right through it, about 1/4 into the buttonhole. So not half, because buttons never stay in the middle, but 1/4 into the buttonhole. And I go straight on the other side of my fabric. And now I will push this layer out of the way and I will attach my button with my thread that has been doubled, knotted, and also waxed with this little beeswax that I have here that just lasts forever. So let's sew our button. Our vest is ready. It just needs its final press, and let's look together at the result.